Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously at UC Berkeley and UCLA. Today, my topic is going to be the Æsir and the Vanir gods, and what the differences are, what those differences might really mean, whether these differences really are important in the context of the Eddas, which are our main sources for Norse literature. So let me go over a few of my general points that I often make because they're important to keep in mind as I discuss this topic, even if you've heard some of this before. First of all, the pronunciation that I use in my videos is reconstructed medieval Old Norse pronunciation. Linguists are pretty confident about what Old Norse sounded like 1,000 years ago, and it's not exactly like modern Icelandic, even though more people use modern Icelandic pronunciation for Old Norse today than use that reconstructed pronunciation. The main reason I bring this up, spend a little bit of time on this at the beginning of this video, is that I'm going to be saying the word Æsir a lot, and I want you to just know that that's not me mispronouncing modern Icelandic Æsir, which is how it's pronounced today, but me using the reconstructed pronunciation, which is what I'm used to. Æsir is the plural of Os, and that is one of the families of gods. Odin is an Os, Thor is an Os, both of them are Æsir. And then Vanir is the plural for the other family, and the singular of that is Vanir. So Njörður is a Vanir, Freyr is a Vanir, and then they are collectively both Vanir. All right, another thing I want to point out is let's talk a little bit about our sources. We have the Poetic Edda, which is a compilation of poems written down in about 1270. It is copied from a manuscript written down about 1200, and from linguistic evidence we have several poems that are older than 1000. That is important to keep in mind for this presentation, because I'm often going to mention that a poem is old as a reason to think that it is a better source for pre-Christian belief, and understand that what I mean when I say that it's old is that there's some kind of linguistic evidence that it was composed long before it was written down. I've talked about that stuff a little bit in my video called Evidence Before the Eddas. I'll put a card linking to that on the top right hand corner of the screen, and I may eventually make a video that looks at some of the poems and kind of roughly dates them or something like that. That might be an interesting topic of the future. Okay, so that's the Poetic Edda. Then there's the Prose Edda, which is the work of just one writer, Snorri Sturluson, born 1178 or 79, dead in 1241. In the Prose Edda, Snorri tries to explain all the myths that he knows in the process of trying to explain how to compose traditional Old Norse poetry. He quotes the Poetic Edda pretty often, and pretty often the information in the Prose Edda is transparently traceable to poems in the Poetic Edda or to similar poems that didn't make it into that particular anthology and that we only know from quotes in Snorri. But keep in mind, in this discussion, I'm also going to talk about another book by Snorri. Snorri wrote Heimskringla, a history of the kings of Norway. This book is typically printed in 3 volumes today, whether in the original or in translation. And it consists of several individual sagas of Norwegian kings. And the very first constituent saga of Heimskringla is Ynglinga Saga, Saga of the Ynglings, the mythical ancestors of the Norwegian and Swedish royal families. And so, of course, this includes the gods, but in the Saga of the Ynglings, Snorri euhemerizes the gods much more than he does even in the prologue to the Prose Edda. He presents them as human ancestors that people misinterpreted as gods. Nonetheless, the Saga of the Ynglings is actually one of our main sources for the idea that the Æsir and the Vanir are particularly different. So I'm going to be mentioning that. Just keep in mind that's another work by our good friend Snorri. All right, so let's talk about the Æsir and the Vanir after that long series of introductory remarks. The conventional understanding of the Vanir is that they include Njörður and his 2 twin children, his son Freyr and his daughter Froya. Heimdallr might be one. I'll talk about the hint about that in a moment. And we can probably count the originally giant or Jotun wives of Njörður and Freyr, Skadi and Gerður respectively, as Vanir by marriage. So in the Saga of the Ynglings, Snorri gives an account of the Vanir as coming from a place in Vanaheimr, named Vanaheimr, that he puts into the geography of the earth. He says that it is the land along the river he calls the Vanakvisel, which he says is from the name Tanakvisel, which he says is from the name Tanais. Now Tanais or Tanais, that is the ancient Greek name of the Don River in Russia, which was regarded in the ancient world as the boundary between Europe and Asia. Why is this important? Because Snorri thinks that Æsir or Osgarður, realm of the Æsir, is Asia. He connects those two words in a typical medieval way, looking for etymologies where they don't exist. In fact, the word Æsir or Os is an old Indo-European word connected to a word in Hittite. I think it's Hasu, Hasuras, which means king, a word in Avestan, Ahura, which is lord or ruler or god, and Sanskrit Ashura, which is more of a demon figure. It's probably an old Indo-European root meaning creator or something along those lines. Easily becomes words for king or god. Okay, so he's trying to locate them in this land. The Æsir in Asia, then he's putting Vanaheimr along this river, which is the border between Europe and Asia, so close to the Æsir, but not in the same exact place. And he claims that there was a great army in the Saga of the Inklings. It says there's a great army of the Æsir that fights a great army of the Vanir, that this war ends with them making peace and exchanging hostages, and so Njordr is the hostage who comes to Osgarður to live among the Æsir, and then the Æsir send hostages including Hunir, a little-known figure who just crops up now and then, including in the story of Ragnarok and the story of the creation of human beings, as well as Mimir, and then along with Njordr went someone named Kvasir. This is actually really different from the story he tells in the Prose Edda and Skaldskaparmál, where he says that Kvasir is created by the Æsir and the Vanir spitting into a vat together. And that is part of the story of this meat of poetry, Odrerir, which I've covered in another video. I'll link that in the top right. He says that when Njordr and his son Freyr come over as hostages, the daughter of Njord was Froya, who he calls a priestess. Gyðja, the same word, can mean goddess, but in this euhemerized context, we should probably read priestess. And that it was she who first brought Seidr magic among the Æsir. All right. Seidr magic, which I've talked about somewhat in my video about the vulva. Again, I'll link that in the top right when there's a moment up in the cards. Seidr magic is associated with some sort of sexual shame, especially for men who practice it. Right after that, he says that Njordr was married to his own sister among the Vanir, and that this was lawful among the Vanir, and that Freyr and Freyja are their children. But among the Æsir, it is not allowed to engage in such clear incest. So it's interesting that Snorri traces these sexually shameful acts to the Vanir, both incest and the practice of Seidr magic, pretty clearly distinguishing them as having some kind of sexual oddity about them. All right. Now, if we look at Gylfaginning, the main part of the Prose Edda as far as the mythology is concerned, it's interesting to note that the Vanir are barely mentioned as a separate thing. This is the part of the Prose Edda where Snorri is really trying to introduce the concepts of the gods and goddesses to us and their stories, and he barely mentions who the Vanir are as a separate unit. He talks about Njordr, Freyr, and Freyja, but he doesn't really get into what it means that they're Vanir or how the Vanir are distinguished. We do have the part where he's introducing Njordr, and he basically quotes the stanza of Vafthrûdn the Small that says that Njordr was sent as a hostage to the Æsir from the Vanir. Okay, for that, Snorri's not really an independent source because he's quoting a poem in the Poetic Edda. There's also an unusual lost poem that's mentioned where Frigg sends her messenger goddess Gno somewhere on an errand, and the Vanir see her riding up in the sky and wonder who is flying there. Once again, I've covered this little poem actually in another video, so I'll link that in the top right. This is a very linkful video. So that's interesting. It seems to imply that Gno, so it says, one time when she rode, she has a horse that rises to the sky. Some Vanir saw her up in the sky. Then one of them said, what flies there, what goes or passes through the air? This implies that there's a group of Vanir somewhere else, like Vanaheimr, that a messenger from the Æsir might go to. And of course, the fact that Vafthrûdn the Small in the Poetic Edda says that Njordr was sent to the Æsir as a hostage from Vanaheimr also strongly implies that Vanaheimr really is a different place with a different population of gods that Njordur is sent to the Æsir from. But there are people who are strongly suspicious of the idea that the Vanir are distinct from the Æsir in a meaningful way in the pre-Christian period, and the most notable among them is Rudolf Ziemek at the University of Bonn. Rudy's a great guy, and I think that he's got some great points here. So let me also present his side of the argument, and I'm not speaking for him, but let me sum up what I understand to be his best arguments for why the Vanir might not actually be originally really a distinct class. He points out that if you look at Old Norse poetry, there are many different synonyms that mean God. The poetry is alliterative, so we have lots of different words that can mean God that we'll use depending on what we need to alliterate in a particular poetic line. There's regin if you need to alliterate with an R, ginregin or goð if you need to alliterate with a G, Æsir if you need to alliterate with a vowel or with the consonant y, because all those alliterate in Old Norse tradition. Hopt if you need to alliterate with an H, Bond if you need to alliterate with a B, Tivar if you need to alliterate with a T. And Vanir only comes up in 5 poems in the Poetic Edda, and where it appears, it's always alliterating, just like these other words for God. So could this originally be a word for the gods that gets misunderstood by later writers, including Snorri, to mean some kind of different type of god? It's interesting when we look at the context where Vanir comes up in the Poetic Edda. So probably the most distinct context is in Vafthrudnismal, where Odin says to Vafthrudnir, Riddle Weaver, the giant that he's having a wisdom contest with, he says in stanza 38, "Tell me this 10th, you must know the fate of all the gods, wise Riddle Weaver. How did Njord come to be among the Æsir? He has hundreds of temples and altars, but he was not born among the Æsir." To which Riddle Weaver replies, stanza 39, "Wise gods created him in Vanaheimr and gave him as a hostage to the gods. At Ragnarok he will go back home to the wise Vanir." So this does imply, again, a separate existence for the Vanir in a separate place, Vanaheimr. But the other context in the Poetic Edda, it's very difficult to infer what the Vanir are or if they're actually something different. So for instance, in Völuspá, stanza 24, we see Knotu Vanir Víkspa Völusporna, where we've got this in alliteration. And it's interesting to note, that's stanza 24. So let's look at stanza 23. I've put the different words for gods in different colors so you can see what's alliterating with what. Thor gengu regen olo rukstola. So we have regen to alliterate with rukstola. We've got goth to alliterate with ginhelog and gatusk. We've got Æsir alliterating with ofroth. We've got goth again alliterating with gildi. Then in stanza 24, when Vanir comes up, it's alliterating again. And it's interesting to note that this is coming in a context right after we've got a stanza that has lots of different synonyms for God. So it looks like a context where maybe Vanir shouldn't be read as something separate. And in fact, even though Snorri apparently interprets this as a story about the Æsir and the Vanir fighting each other, it's not clear who they're fighting. They could be fighting together against someone else, and Vanir might not even mean Vanir as a separate group here. It could just be chosen because it alliterates with Víkspol and Volu. So this could just be the gods' new war magic. The gods trampled the valleys. So that's just not conclusive for the Vanir being something different. Then in Thrymskvi, the stanza 15, when Heimdallr speaks up and he says, let's put a wedding dress on Thor. This, of course, is that crazy story. We read, "Thor kvað that Heimdallr hvítastur ossa, vissi hann vel fram sem Vanir aðrir." Then Heimdallr said, he was the whitest of gods, whitest of Æsir. I tend to think this means most handsome, because hvítur doesn't refer to what we mean when we call a person white in English. It's never used that way. Anyway, I've talked about this before. He knew well forward like other Vanir. Notice that he's called whitest or handsomest of Æsir, but he's also said to be like the other Vanir. And the Vanir alliterates with Vissi and Vel. So is he really being called Vanir, or is this just a word for God that's being used because of what it alliterates with? He's called Æsir and Vanir here. Hard to say. Then, of course, we get the word Vanir all over all of these small, stanza 10, 12, 18, 22, 24, 26, 28, 32, and 34, because Alvis the dwarf is listing what different peoples call different things: the sun, the moon, the earth, beer, whatever. Typically things that alliterate with their names. So we see, for instance, Kala Vega Vanir. That's in stanza 10. Vega and Vanir are alliterating. So Alvis Small is basically a mine for kinnings, or Haiti names, alternative names for things, and typically those names are going to alliterate with a group of people or supernatural beings said to use that name. So also not exactly conclusive. In Forskirnes, Frøer is called a Vaningi by Gerther in stanza 37. That may be a diminutive to Vanir, or just a statement of someone who belongs to the Vanir family. Okay. But otherwise then, in Sigurd Drivumal and in Forskirnes, we get this formula about the Æsir, the Olvar, the elves, and the wise Vanir, right? With Æsir and Olvar alliterating because they both start with vowels, and then vis, wise, and Vanir alliterating, whatever the grammatical form is, visum, vonum, visavana, where clearly this formula exists because these are alliterating pairs and you get an easy couple of lines. So not very conclusive there. So really, when you look at the Poetic Edda, other than that one part of Vafthrudnismal, Vanir does really just look like another word for God. That doesn't mean something separate, that maybe Snorri is exaggerating. But I do think that Vafthrudnismal stands. I do think Vafthrudnismal is old, and that it does imply there's something different about the Vanir, as does that one poem about Gno that Snorri quotes from a poem that's lost to us. There's also a little bit of evidence from outside of the texts for the Vanir being different. Place names, for example. If you look around Uppsala, I'm going to say it the Icelandic way, Uppsala, but I think Swedes say Uppsala, Sweden. All the place names related to gods are Vanir gods. And the more you move away from Uppsala, the fewer Vanir you see and the more Æsir you see. This seems to imply that perhaps there were particular areas where the Æsir were more prominent and areas where the Vanir were more prominent, and that the area around Uppsala, Sweden, was an area where the Vanir were particularly prominent. Icelandic sagas make it seem like the Vanir are especially big in Sweden. We read, for instance, in Ogmundar Þóttur Dits, about a Norwegian outlaw who goes to Sweden and finds himself basically impersonating the god Frøer in a Swedish cultic context where Frøer is worshipped and idol of Frøer is driven around different fields in order to make them fertile. And it's interesting that in the Icelandic sagas and in Landnámabók, the Icelandic book of the settlers, they really single out guys as Frøs Goði, a Goði of Frøer. Like this is something a little bit unusual to be a Goði or priest of a Vanir god. And women, when they are singled out as being Goði, the feminine is Gyðja. Well, if a god is mentioned that they are dedicated to, it will be a Vanir god. This seems to imply at least some kind of like different denomination, almost, right? One that perhaps like Episcopalian versus Catholic, has some female clergy as opposed to one that has just male clergy. And that it's somewhat unusual in an Icelandic context that somebody is part of that more Vanir denomination. Although if you read Landnámabók, the sacred ring oath that is sworn at assemblies on the ring worn by the Goði is sworn by Frøer og Njörður og in Almotki Os, by Frøer and Njörður and the almighty Os, one of the Æsir. So that's interesting, suggesting that Frøer and Njörður perhaps as Vanir have maybe a closer relationship to the swearing of oaths, to that kind of cultic function. The almighty one of the Æsir, presumably meaning Odin, but also probably it could be Thor. It kind of reminds me of in Håkonar's Saga Go, the Saga of Håkon the Good, which is also in Snorri's Heimskringla, where they swear a toast to Njörður, then a toast to Frøer for a good harvest and peace, and they've drunk a toast to Odin for victory and the reign of the king. That does kind of imply that Odin is that almighty Os, if it's a parallel formula. We also see a strong association of the Vanir gods with agricultural male animals. For instance, Olaf's Saga Tryggvasonar in Mesta, in the manuscript Flateyjarbók, mentions a herd of stallions, which I don't even want to think about what kind of trouble that involves, at Frøer's temple in Trondheim. We read about horses named Frøyfaxi in some of the sagas, including Vatnsøl saga and the very famous one given up to Freyr in Hrafnkels saga. There's also boars. Snorri says that Freyr has a boar named Gullinbursti in Skaldskaparmál, and in the poem Völuspá Skama, Freyja rides that boar. That might remind us a little bit of the oath boar, Sonargolter, from Hervarar saga og Heiðreks, some versions of it, and Helgakvíða Hjörvarssonar, that oaths are sworn on. Perhaps in the Vanir's role as gods, that oaths are sworn upon or sworn with the help of, the boar is also an accessory to that, just like the ring might be. In Brandkrossatholter, we read about a bull sacrificed to Freyr, and in Gisli saga, a bull is sacrificed at winter nights, a festival that Thithrandatholter says is associated with Freyr. So again, we have male agricultural animals. It's also interesting to note that, of course, Thor is associated with another kind of agricultural animal, the goat. So maybe this doesn't work out perfectly. But it does suggest, again, a little bit of a distinct nature to the Vanir. The Vanir men also notably marry down. In this society, as in many others, men are supposed to marry even social status or a little bit lower, and women are supposed to marry of even social status or a little bit higher. The Vanir men, Njordr and Freyr, are not allowed to marry Æsir women, apparently, because both of them have to take their brides from giants. Njordr marries Skadi, who's basically tricked into marrying him, apparently sort of deliberately, based on the story Snorri tells in Skaldskaparmál about her choosing her husband by his feet alone, which surely excites some corners of the internet, thinking she's choosing Baldur because he will have the prettiest feet, but it turns out to be the Vanir god Njordr because he has the cleanest feet because he's in the ocean all the time. Anyway, and then of course the famous story in Skirnis, which I really need to make a video about, where Freyr sends Skirnir to court and bully the giant woman Gerður into marrying him. But the point is, the Jotnar, the giants, are clearly socially inferior to the gods. But the Vanir are a little bit under the Æsir because they are still choosing from below them. They are not allowed to choose from the Æsir goddesses and marry into them. I do think that suggests that the Vanir are a little bit different. And as an aside to that, Skirnis, the poem that I mentioned, where Freyr sends Skirnir to court Gerður, has no Æsir in actual speaking or active parts. They're mentioned a couple times, basically in passing, but only Vanir gods speak and act. It's only Freyr, Njordr, Skadi, and then Skirnir, who I guess you could count as Vanir. He says he's not an elf or an Æsir or a Vanir, so whoever he is, he's another speaking part. There's no Æsir speaking parts, no Æsir active parts, so perhaps that comes from what you might call a Vanir denomination that might tell more stories about the Vanir, whereas the bulk of the stories in the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda are clearly Æsir focused. So, are they different? Opinions differ. I've gone back and forth about this. I tend to think that there's a little bit of a difference, maybe not as much of a difference as Snorri wants there to be. I think maybe Snorri is making too much out of the hints in Völuspá about the war early in the history of the world, that this may not have been between the Æsir and the Vanir at all. But his story he tells about Kvasir being the origin of Otharir, I do think is potentially pretty old because of hints about it in poems that we do know are old. So, who knows? Definitely, I think they're different, that they did believe that these were somewhat different groups. I just think that Snorri is exaggerating the difference. That's my executive summary here. I hope if you enjoy these videos made for free in beautiful places in Colorado and Wyoming, that you'll consider checking out my Patreon, which is now integrated with a Discord community, which has been kind of fun. We have our own emoticons now, it turns out. And I hope you check out my translations of the original sources of the Norse myths. I've got the Poetic Edda and the Saga of the Volsungs out from Hackett Publishing Company already, soon to be followed by my translations of Hervarar saga og Heiðreks, Hrolfs saga Kraka, and the Prose Edda after that. And the Prose Edda, my translation will include the Saga of the Inglings as a bonus for those who want to see everything Snorri wrote about the Norse gods. For now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.